Thank you, and welcome to the Rules and City Government Committee. For the record, we have all members of the committee present, Alderman Arnett and Alderman Savage. We're joined by City Manager Gerald and City Attorney Lyles. Our Finance Director is Dickinson. Our crackpot technician, not crackpot, Cracker Jack. Sorry, Julian, I'm trying to give you a compliment. Our excellent technician and our city council associate. And so let's begin the approval of the agenda. Alderman Arnett, do you want to make a motion?
Yes, Madam Chair. I would like to move that we postpone consideration of 1919 until we get back a report from the three department heads, planning and zoning, transportation, and public works. So that would be the amendment. I don't know what to do with 05120, but I will certainly move to take 1919 off the agenda.
I will second that.
Okay. And so we'll leave Emancipation Day on. We can always postpone action when it comes up, which is first on the list. Okay, so the motion is to approve the agenda with the elimination of 1919. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Julian liked my comment. Okay, first item of approval of the minutes from the February 9th meeting.
Madam
Can I get a
Chair,
motion?
I move approval of the minutes from February 9th.
Motion.
Okay, motion to approve the minutes is written. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so the first legislative item on our agenda is 05120, which is Emancipation Day. And I'm still not seeing Alderman Schandelmeyer.
He said it was working, so it might be hard for him to get free to come to this meeting.
Okay, then why don't we take 0621, and maybe by the time we finish that, Mr. Schandelmeyer will be with us, and we can see how we're going to dispatch with that.
Okay.
So 0621, agency regulations for the purpose of establishing a procedure for the adoption of regulations by a City of Annapolis department, board, or commission, requiring public notice, providing an appeal process, and generally relating to City of Annapolis regulations. Alderman Arnett, this is your legislation. Would you like to?
Yes, if I may, I would. So currently in Title II, it's actually Title 204090, regulations adoption and posting of on the city website is what it's titled. It has in there a section A, which is the purpose section, a section B, which says on and after June 1st, 2020, a department, board, or commission may not adopt regulations unless, and then one code expressly authorizes the adoption of such regulation. And I would note that of late, the Office of Law has been putting such authorization into legislation. And then it goes on with a section 2. What I thought was good, and this is after back and forth with both Mr. Lyles, but more particularly Assistant City Attorney Braithwaite, was if we're going to do rules and regulations, and that is a very interesting term in and of itself, we need to be able to allow departments to do rules and regulations, because right now the code largely says they can't. And I thought that a rules and regulation process, which I'm familiar with, which is rulemaking by the federal government, would be a reasonable, open, and transparent process. I know that we can discuss whether or not the process that I have drafted is exactly the right process to go. But the intent of the legislation was to have a known process, a regular process, a process that is transparent, and a process that has rules for when regulations go into effect, and also a section on how regulations can be appealed by parties affected by the regulations. So that's sort of a prelude to the legislation itself. I did have, and I think you all have received, I had a very cordial and productive meeting with Jim Conlon, who has years and years and years of experience with federal regulations. And we talked about a couple of changes that he would like us to discuss. And also Ashley Leonard's, Assistant City Attorney Ashley Leonard, had put in a red line, which I thought we were going to accept that red line version, had put in some comments. I think there were two. One of them had to do with we need to be more specific about when a regulation is approved. And I forget what the other one was, but there were two things that she noted from the draft that the Office of Law prepared for me were not sufficient. And I'm hoping that Mr. Lyles is here to help us through those two items. Other than that, I think the legislation speaks pretty much for itself. There are probably some fixes we need to make, but I don't think that many from my perspective. And so I'm willing to go through it however you wish to proceed, Madam Chair.
Well, I think there's some significant changes. I mean, you're putting in code a specific process. And it appears that the first piece of it speaks to public notification of that process. Am I correct?
That is correct.
It's ABCD. And so in a nutshell, you're giving the community an opportunity to weigh in on this change and with a specific timeline for doing so.
That's correct. So it would be a new regulation or a change. And the word regulation is something we need to take a moment to discuss when you're prepared for that. But it would be either a new regulation that isn't on the books currently or a change to a regulation that is on the books.
So which piece of this speaks to the new and the ongoing? I'm not seeing.
So the first one, Section A, is just saying that we're going to have a process, and then it says this process will take effect. It had July 21st in there. We can worry about that. And then it says when you want to do a regulation, you make notice of regulation and allow 30 days for comment. Mm-hmm. You have a public hearing, and the public can comment. My suspicion is unless it's something really big, there won't be much public participation at that time. Then it goes in Section C, after the public hearing, they will comment on any comments they've received during that open period. And then D, prior to the effective date, the relevant regulation would come to the City Council. And there would be a summary promulgated of all of the comments and the response to comments.
My question had to do with a existing regulation that's being changed or a new regulation that's being created. Do all four of those steps apply to either option?
Or, in my perspective, yes.
Okay. All right. And it doesn't speak to that specifically, and that's why I was asking that question.
There's another specific, this is what I gleaned from my conversation from Mr. Conlon, and it's what I remembered after that conversation. In the federal government, it's really called a notice of rulemaking. And if you look up rules and regulations in the dictionary, they're very circular. Basically, in Mr. Conlon's concept, which I subscribe to, a regulation is actually a publication of rules. It's a document that contains rules in some form or another, which could be a pamphlet, it could be a form, it could be, any number of things, but the regulation is really the vehicle by which rules are set forth. So rules could be promulgated on the city website, and that would be a form of publication. So, and that's why I'm glad Mr. Lyles is here, because I think that's a nuance. I don't need to get into it, but I think maybe we probably should think about that a little bit. That's a nuance of what it is we're really doing. The code, the original code says rules and regulations that have the force of law. And those are the ones that I think I'm most interested in. Those are rules that have a fee, a fine, some kind of process, some kind of requirement associated with them, which would impinge upon the using public for people wanting to do anything in the city of Annapolis that fall under the rules.
Okay.
I got everybody excited with that one.
Mr. Lyles, do you want to weigh in on anything that the Alderman has said thus far? And we only have gotten through the first, really the first 4 changes, which has to do with, I guess, public notification. But
yeah, we're still working this out. We drafted it, but I still have some issues with it. And I think Alderman Arnett talked about one of them. That's the definition of the word regulation. We probably want to add that, and we can do that. I have some other comments about the other sections. So when we get there.
Okay.
So where would you put the definition of regulations under on page 2?
I don't know. I probably would be we'd probably create an under A or B of the section 04090. For the purpose of the section, the word regulation shall mean, so it'll probably be in that paragraph or in the following subsequent paragraph.
So we're on page 2, somewhere page lines 3 to 8 or something like that.
If you look at the page 2 of the draft, right under what is 2.04090, that's the way the code currently looks at that top paragraph.
Yeah.
Probably add a sentence there or another subsection, or make a B and then a B becomes C. I have to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah. But
I would be
defining regulation would be a good thing to add here.
Yes, I would be very receptive to that. I know Alderman Savage has his hand up, but I think that's where we also get into, I think there may be gradations of rules. Some rules come with, as I said before, fines and penalties and requirements. That to me is the one that has the most likelihood to be and have an impact on our constituents. Some rules are just simply, here's the form you have to fill out to apply for such and such. I think that's basically internal business on the part of the staff, how they're processing applications or things like that. I suppose it could raise to the level of being something of an imposition, but I don't think that the council needs to get involved in that kind of level. And I think this speaks to what City Manager Gerald was talking about in terms of bandwidth, that this could be a big imposition on staff time. And to that end, I asked the director if we could get a list of all of the current regulations, which itself turns out to be a fairly onerous process. But I kind of feel we ought to be aware of all of what's dubbed, in the current parlance anyway, regulations. So, but I think getting that definition in and deciding what is a rule in the context of this and what is a process in the context of day-to-day operations on the part of a department, which I'm not so much interested in, and I don't think the council would be terrifically interested in going over all of that either. Although we did get into it some with applications for things like Forest Conservation Act and stormwater management. So there are some places where it becomes important.
I'll go to Alderman Savage before I make a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just generally, I wanted to start off by saying I support this idea. I think, as you mentioned, Alderman Arnett, we do have current processes, but I'm not sure how closely they've been followed in terms of posting some of the new regulations that have been created over the years. Some of them have, like the forest conservation and stormwater management, although I don't know if they're put in a clear place on the website for people to review. But in any case, I agree with this in the sense that I think for transparency, that I think the public would like transparency for a number of our regulations, but also I think for the council's perspective, it's good for us to be able to see what regulations come out of the legislation we pass, so we can ensure that the regulations meet the intent of the legislation, but also to see if we need to update any of the code with new legislation, or if we need to give us some other clarification with the city manager's office. But I do think it'd be good, maybe we can have some kind of collection of regulations housed in the law office. Like, I don't know if each department could send simply forward whatever existing or new regulations they have over to law office or somewhere else where they could just file them away in some large, essentially a book, or and also for uploading to the website. So I do think this is a valuable thing to have. But all that said, I am trying to be mindful of staff's concerns. So at some point, Madam Chair, I do have some concerns I'd like to bring up. I also have a couple other tweaks. But before that, I'll just mention regarding the definition. I did like the definition that I think Jim Conlon had put in his testimony, which was, it said regulations mean publications of rules issued by agencies to carry out the intent of legislation. Kind of simple to the point, and I think we could put it where the city attorney mentioned, or I think the place I was thinking was just page 2, line 2, just creating a new section for definition. But I don't know if there may be an existing definition section in chapter 204. But that may not need to get decided today. I'm not sure if we're going to end up finishing our work on this today or not. But just an idea out there for the law office if you end up drafting definition. But I would also like, if there are some other concerns that I think Alderman Arnett mentioned from the law office, which be useful, I think, in the future with some of these suggestions, if we could get them in the form of amendment from the law office. Because I did understand and agree with some of your points, but I wasn't quite sure exactly the best way to go about making those changes that you're suggesting. And I'm not sure if that's something that we could do easily during this meeting or not. So those are my general comments. I'm doing a specifics later on.
Thank you, Alderman. I'm going to ask City Manager Gerald to weigh in. And correct me if I'm wrong. It feels like we're getting very close to overstepping our boundaries as policymakers to getting into day-to-day operations of professional staff. Not having clear lines between regulations, policy, and I guess practice, to me, may be part of the problem. So, Director or City Manager Gerald, are you feeling like there is some encroachment on professional staff's practices? Or is this a normal step towards cleaning up, simply cleaning up how we do business?
No, I think it's a fair change in the process for establishing regulations, because I think that's within the council's purview, is to establish a process. I think if they started directing staff on what regulations need to be put together and what needs to be in those regulations or rules, I think that would be overstepping. But to establish a process whereby they're established, and a process where council's notified on a periodic basis of what regulations exist, I think that's all fair. And I can tell you that in preparation for this meeting, and probably more appropriately for the next Rules Committee meeting, I've asked each department to put together a list of all the regulations that they have issued, with the date that they were issued and where they reside. Based on my experience in public works, and maybe that's not indicative of all the departments, but I don't think we issued a single regulation during my time in public works. So I'm not sure that there's going to be that many rules and regulations out there. Even for the stormwater, when council passed the resolution that increased the desired amount of stormwater treatment, I implemented that through a memorandum to staff, giving them direction on what our targets needed to be based on the resolution. So that wasn't a regulation. And maybe that could have been a regulation, but that was just really an implementing instruction to staff. So I'm not sure how many of these rules and regulations even exist out there. So this is kind of a learning process for all of us. But I do think that we need to have a central repository for all of these. And maybe the city clerk's the right place, or the law office. The city attorney and I can work that out so it's a place that makes sense. But I think that needs to exist, is whatever rules and regulations we have, that they're kept in a central repository so we can keep track of them.
And I think it could be virtual.
That sounded, well, it sounded like a much more monumental task. And I guess this is where the definitions come into play, because I would have expected there to be tons of regulations that we'd be asking for, some sort of compilation of. But it sounds like it's not that kind of exercise, I'll just say. Mr. Lyles, I see you.
Yeah, Merriam-Webster defines, and I agree with this definition, that a regulation is defined as a rule that is issued by an executive authority or a regulatory agency. And so I agree with that, because what we're talking about is really executive staff issuing rules for the details that are set out in the code, right? So the part that is probably where you don't have a lot of regulations is because the code has been infused or filled with a lot of regulatory language, such that the details of things that you want to codify, and really the councils have two main ways that they tell people what to do: ordinances and resolutions. Regulations inure to the executive group because they don't do ordinances and resolutions. But to the extent that our code has a level of detail that is like regulatory agency detail or regulations, it obviates the need for the executive branch the executive staff to come up with that kind of detail.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Alderman Arnett, and then Alderman Savage.
So I think Mr. Lyles has definitely put his finger on it. And in fact, the thing that excited my curiosity to go back and look at the code was largely things that were going on as we were looking at the adequate public facilities, and this express notion from law, and particularly in my conversations with Joel, that way too many things were in code that really ought not to be in code. And I'm certainly open to that as a possibility. And it would be nice if someday in our life the code could get down to 1 volume instead of 2. But it seemed to me that there needed to be some sort of process so we know what is being taken out of code and going into rules and regulations. But rules and regulations that have the force of law or impinge upon our constituents in some way, which they may find onerous, who knows, are things that I think that we will get people coming to us. I just had an incident brought to me where somebody was interested in applying for a rental license. They mistakenly applied for a long-term rental license. So they said, oh, well, we want a short-term rental license, and can we have both? And they were told no. I don't know that that's in the code. And I think that there are things that we need to understand about that. And in fact, quite frankly, if someone's willing to pay for both a short-term and a long-term rental license, I don't know why we would deny them that, and it would give them some flexibility. But regulations are really where the staff meet the citizens and the people doing business with the city. And so they can have some impact coming back on us saying, how come you make us do so-and-so? And we say, well, we didn't make you do that. That was David Gerald that did that. So I think that there needs to be some kind of a relationship there. At a minimum, I mean, when I started thinking about it, I realized I have no idea how many regulations or rules the city has promulgated, and maybe don't need to know, but certainly am curious about it. So I think that this new impetus, which I'm not saying I disagree with, that we need to get things culled out of code that more properly exists someplace else, bring it on, but let's have a participatory process for doing that.
Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on that point, I think I have kind of 3 concerns, points of discussion. But the first, I guess, since you're talking about the hearing and public participation, I'll start with that. So the proposal has where kind of 3 different steps for the public process, and that would be once the regulation has been, and this is another issue, I guess, adopted, which I think law had concerned about that, the term adopted, but in any case, so the process is it gets posted on the city's website for no less than 30 days, and the public can submit written comments during that time. And then the second step is it would go to, the regulations would go to the Board of Commission and the City Council Committee, appropriate City Council Committee, for essentially another round of public comments, and then and presentation from presumably from the department, and then discussion from the committee. And I'm not sure if there's a vote with that, but that's also something for further discussion. But the third step is it would go to a public hearing held by the department or the board or the commission, whoever's proposing this. So the department would hold a public hearing after the written comment period closes for live, essentially a public testimony. So my concern, I guess, in trying to respond to the concern raised by I believe the city manager in the staff report in terms of staff workload, is that I want to be mindful of not piling on too much. My suggestion would be removing C, that third step. So removing the third public hearing, because I think we could use there are already 2 opportunities for public hearings. The main one would be at the committee level. People could come and testify, and then they'd also have that initial written public comment period. But I think for the sake of efficiency, it might make sense to just have the public comments be at that committee meeting. Because, I just, speaking as someone who in the professional job does have to occasionally have public hearings, they can be a bit burdensome to organize and prepare for. So I could certainly see that being a bit of a burden for staff. So that'd be, I don't know if the sponsors open to that idea, and I'm curious if the city manager thinks that would be helpful or not.
So
Mr. Gerald?
Yeah, I do think it would be helpful, but I need to understand what paragraph B entails, because the way it reads is that the copy of the regulation, proposed regulation, is provided, but it doesn't say that it needs to be approved or even discussed or anything by Rules Committee. It just says it's provided to the Rules Committee. So was the intent of that to have it discussed and approved by Rules, or was it just sort of an information type copy to Rules?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I can speak to this, and that really comes out of my conversations with Joelle. Basically, the intent there is to just make either the council or the Rules Committee aware that there's a regulation being promulgated. If the council feels that there's something wrong or something they'd like to change, it would go through a legislative process. It would go through an ordinance or a resolution, as Mr. Lyles said, to say, gee, we really are not comfortable with that. But it is not for approval by the Rules Committee or the council. The regulations, once they become regulations, are the province of the departments or organizations that are issuing them. And at that point, the only time council would come back and get involved is if there's something that it feels to us through, say, input from our constituents isn't working the way it should. So that is actually taming down some of the things that I was originally saying, yeah, it would have to come before us and we would have to approve it and all of that sort of thing. All this is just letting us know we fall in the same hopper as everybody else who gets the 30-day notice. And so if we get that notice and we say, gee, we better talk to somebody about this because I'm worried about this or I want to make that stronger, we're with the rest of the public. So it was meant to be that we are notified, we get a copy of this. And going back up to line 11, I think you're right. Once the regulation has been proposed, not adopted is the wrong word there. Once it's been proposed. So let's say planning and zoning wants to do a new regulation on how to, or let's say the harbor master wants to do a new regulation on how to use boat ramps, which could actually come to our attention. They would simply promulgate, and Beth has actually been doing this with a lot of her things. She's come to us with changes that she intends to make operating in the Annapolis waters more efficient. So Beth wants to make a new rule. The rule is proposed. It has a 30-day open period. Once that proposed rule is promulgated, it's still in the open hearing phase. The Rules Committee or the council, however we want to do it, I said Rules Committee because I don't know how much we want to involve the whole council, but we could do the whole council. also is notified that there's a rulemaking that's going on. And then I do resist not having a public hearing, but I will certainly be open to changes. My thinking there is, how many times have we heard, gee, I didn't know anything about this ordinance. I didn't know anything about this rule. I don't like it. And I think that there's first of all, I think there's fairness and transparency in letting people know we're doing rulemaking. But secondly, I think there's a protection saying it was notified, it was on the city's website, it was open for 30 days. You had opportunity to come and comment, give us your input. We would have loved to have had it. But we had an open, transparent process. It depends upon how many rules we think we're going to be issuing, how onerous that is. But frankly, I think preparing for a public hearing is probably a good thing for staff to do. They need to be thinking about all the kinds of things that the public may be commenting on and being prepared for that. So I think it's work that probably needs to be done anyway.
Let me go ahead, Mr. Lyles.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with removing the word adoption. The reason it was in there was because that particular section refers to adoption throughout it. So we just carried it forward, but we would agree with the word promulgation as well as publication. In most instances, rules are effective on an effective date or as when published. So I would offer that we could take some modifications to this section by removing the word adoption and adding promulgation and publication as opposed to posting, because publication can be posting as well, but publication is more customarily associated with the effectiveness or the effective date of regulations.
Right.
And so an adoption is more akin to ordinances and resolutions and not regulations, since regulations are usually effective upon publication.
Would you also agree that in letter B on that same page that we could simply say that all relevant departments, boards, including the Rules Committee, would be notified?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with B, and Joelle and I talked about it. We suggested that the notification to the Rules Committee be appropriate. One, because of the vast majority of the rules or regulations that might come out, unless you see something problematic, you can review it and move it on. It wouldn't necessarily have to be in a meeting and then held up because the committee didn't meet. And so now it's 30 days past when the regulation needs to be effectuated. So if you see it, you have a problem with it, you can stop it. If not, it becomes pro forma, and because we're looking for efficiency in getting the regulation actually published to the public.
Well, and the next step asks for then a public hearing, which, in letter A, it's written testimony for 30 days. Right. And then notification, and then a public hearing. Isn't that what I'm reading? Letter C.
Well, in my view, you can have both, but the key for us would be not to weigh it down with the types of hearings that would make a regulation that needs to be done in 30 days. Now it's 90 days. So what normally is required in Maryland for any kind of regulation like this or any kind of law, that the public needs to have notice and an opportunity to be heard. And we can, restrict that opportunity to be heard to just letters and comments. Many federal agencies, all they do is written comments. You would never go to the SEC and, have a time to testify. You submit your written comments and that would be it. We augur for the more efficient approach, one or the other. And if I've got to have one, I'd prefer to have the written notice and not the hearing. But if we got to have both, I guess we'll make it work, but we would, we argue for the more efficient approach.
Okay, I'm just not seeing the efficiency in what I'm reading here. And you just attested to that. Alderman Savage.
Madam Chair. So in light of this, I think I wanted to introduce, make one motion for an amendment, which would be to, on page 2, line 11, would be to strike adopted and insert promulgated and publicized. Is that the right?
I second that motion.
Okay. Further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of amending page 2, line 11 to read the regulation has been promulgated and what was the other?
Published.
And published as follows. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, Mr.
So
Lyles?
I wanted to speak to Mr. Lyles' previous comment before we lose the thought.
Can you let him speak to this? Because this.
Oh, all right.
I was just going to say that if you get to another amendment, it would be to remove the word adopt from wherever it is in this part of the code, along with what you just done, which is use promulgate and publish. And we can submit something that makes sense from a grammatical standpoint, because I'm just keeping notes here on my page here.
Right.
Okay. Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think there is a balance that I'm trying to achieve here. As Mr. Lyles said, we don't want to making rules as lengthy a process as making ordinances. Certainly, that kind of defeats the purpose of the flexibility and the timeliness of that. And that's why 30 days of an open period, you have to be aware that there's rulemaking in process and get your licks in. The council has to be aware that there's rulemaking in process. And if we have some issues, we have to get our say in there, but then you go on. Now, I guess I've seen it both ways, Mr. Lyle. I've seen public hearings. In fact, I've participated in public hearings on rulemaking, but I will admit, and actually this was, I was telling Rob earlier, this was actually down at the White House where I was testifying on the diagnostic related group testimony as an expert witness with the press there. So, but these were rules that had to do with Medicare payments to hospitals. So it was leveraging hundreds of billions of dollars. So it was a big, important thing. I mean, that rule was all over the place. And I think that one certainly did need to have a public hearing. But perhaps we just say we have the open period, we get the comments, and we close it, and we write the response to comments and promulgate the rule. And maybe there's something where if this is something that is very controversial or has huge impacts, there would be a request for a public hearing. So I'm, in terms of wanting to make it as flexible as possible, that would be something when you're working on rethinking this, that may be something where we can have some sort of an option along those lines. But I agree that the trade-off in getting it out of the code and making the code so voluminous and into the flexibility mode is not something that wants, although I'll tell you, I worked on some nursing home regulations that went on for 5 years. So you don't necessarily get away from it being cumbersome, but that's where people really want to keep weighing in on it. So anyway, I certainly understand what you're saying there, and we could accept some tweaking of that language.
Mr. Lyles? I
would say too that the reason that we thought it appropriate to send it to Rules and City Government is because, as you I think referenced earlier on, the committee could have its own hearing, right? And so that's the opportunity for the hearing to take place assuming the public asked the city rules of city government to be heard on it, or the council people wanted to have a hearing and hear from the public. That would be the opportunity, I think, and it would happen I think in pretty short order, because you're going to receive it and then you can put it on the next your next agenda. But this would, to have both, means that the executive staff would have a hearing and the council could potentially have a hearing, and the full council could probably have a hearing in one of its open sessions. So it's, there's a lot of chance for hearings here.
So are you suggesting that we could eliminate the letter C maybe?
No.
That would be my suggestion, but that's...
And suggest, Alderman, can we finish before you strike it down? And suggest that some language that would speak to, upon request, a public hearing could be held by appropriate department, commission, board, or the rules committee.
Well, you don't need to say it because they can already do it if they want to.
Okay. Alderman Arnett, you were vehemently opposed before I even got it out of my mouth. I mean,
yes. So I was agreeing with Mr. Lyle. I think we already have, we or the department, if they want to, can hold a public hearing. What I wanted to do, I'm responsive to Rob's suggestion. There is merit in this section. If you read it, it could read the relevant board, department, board, or commission following the close of the period for written comments, during which public testimony shall be allowed. The department, board, or commission deliberations on the adoption, or however you want to say that, Mike, of the proposed regulation as amended shall be made public. So it's not calling for a public hearing, but it is saying after you've accepted comments, you've had that open period for 30 days, you've accepted those comments, you will have to, the authorizing body, issuing body, will have to respond to the comments and make a report on how they've responded to those comments. Lots of times we would respond to commenters saying, we heard your suggestion, but that's not the intent of the legislation, so we didn't pursue it.
So in your change to that paragraph, you took out the public hearing.
I did.
And simply said that there would be a response. I'm not sure we want to leave it vague as to, or maybe we do want to leave it vague as to how that response would be given, whether it's a verbal response, they have to have a written response, or whatever.
Well,
Alderman Savage.
They make it public at the end.
Well,
okay.
I'm just wondering if another way, because I was kind of inclined towards just removing C as well, but if you want to make sure we preserve the option to have a public hearing, because I think the option for public hearing is always going to be before the committee again. But anyway, in C, if we remove on line 22, if you remove shall and just put may, so the relevant department, board, or commission may hold a public hearing, and then we could put, so following the close of the period for written comments, we could put a comma after comments and say, if requested, so that basically, if requested by the public. So if the public requests a public hearing, then the department or whomever can hold a public hearing. But again, it just, I don't know, it just seems redundant to me if people are already able to testify. This is kind of a third.
You're correct. There's two thoughts in here. One is this getting, responding to any comments. And then the second thought is, once you've responded to it, so the way you were saying it, it's may hold a public hearing following the close of the period for the written comments. But then the next thing is after they've received all the comments, whether it's written or public, they need to promulgate the deliberations that they went through on, and this is how it works at the federal level, the adoption of the proposed regulation or regulation as amended, and it should be made public.
Well, could that take place simply by posting it on the website? Why would there have to be a significant step on the part of staff? I mean, we want it to notification to get out.
My argument is for transparency.
Well, it's all very transparent if people read, you know.
I'm not clear on how do you want them, or do you want them posted online like the chair is saying, or do you want them, or do you want the deliberation posted in some other fashion?
It would be posted where all regulations are now going to be collectively posted. So there's a change to a regulation. They do the 30-day notice that they're making a change. It is provided to the public and at the same time to the Rules Committee. The commenters have 30 days to get their comments in. The body that is issuing it analyzes the comments and reacts to it in many different ways. You can say, no, we're not doing that, or yes, that's a good idea, or, well, now that you brought it up, maybe we should do such and such. And whatever they do with those deliberations, it then is made public what they've come up with. Now, you're right. The public part of that is actually the promulgation of the new rule. And so it would go to wherever all these rules are now congregated.
Director or City Manager Gerald? What do you think where we are now?
I think my preference would be to get rid of C, and if there needs to be additional language addressing a public hearing by the department, board, or commission, it should be moved up to B, and it should be at the request of the Rules and City Government Committee. So combine B and C and make it only that second public process, only if so requested by Rules, would be my recommendation.
Is law going to, Mike, are you going to do that? Or who's going to reconstitute this?
I'm taking notes.
Good.
So right. if you tell me that that's something you want to have redrafted, we will act in accordance. And I've got the one amendment as well.
Right.
Written down.
There's a few more amendments. I'm not saying I'm keen on this yet, but I certainly am open to making it clearer, because one of the things that's become obvious is that this process is not clear at this point. So, and I am interested in the trade-off between transparency and flexibility.
Alderman Savage?
Yeah, I think that would be good. I think we're moving to a place where we could find some good compromise on this. I do have one hopefully easy amendment in this on this topic. Be on page 2, line 14. So that's under letter A. After regulation, put in the newspaper, comma, and. So it would be the relevant departments, board, or commission shall publish its proposed regulation post the proposed regulation in the newspaper. Although that's not right, because we want to post notice. Shall propose, basically, well, Mr. City Attorney, I think you get my drift. I think we should have a requirement here to post just a notice in the newspaper. Besides just putting it on the website, put something in there. Like we do with some of our other zoning.
Mr. Lyles?
Yeah, let me just say that there is a cost associated with that, and I know my office doesn't have any money to do that. So, because we post some things that are required by the code currently, like for the ABC board, and they do have some changes, and we'd have to figure out how to pay for that, whereas the website is free. And doesn't cost us anything at this point.
My concern with that is just that people have to be proactively checking the website every day or every week to see if something gets posted, where the newspaper people are reading, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are reading every day, and they may not be as crazy as myself, but I look at the public notices every day to see if there's something that I need to respond to or be aware of. That at least shows I think we're making an effort, because I think more people will read the paper than they do browse our website. But then, I think, but in any case, could you get it drafted up and see if get an idea of the cost, so we at least know what it'd be.
If that's a motion, I would second it. But I do agree that we need to be mindful at budget time.
And what newspaper are we talking about? Any newspaper?
It'd be the Capitol, and we have this wording in the zoning code scattered about for public notices for hearings. So I'd have to look up the exact same language, but whatever they have would be sufficient.
So that would also require a change to the fiscal impact statement.
Yeah, and I really have no idea how much those cost.
So we have some ideas. I think Mr. Lyle just mentioned other boards and commissions needing to make public notification in the paper.
Yeah, but I guess the other general comment on all this is that I try to think of some of the scenarios in my head and about some of these regulations. And for example, especially the environmental, which I know the best. So if you're thinking about forest conservation or stormwater, critical area, or non-environmental like site design, there are regulations for each of those laws. And I think in many cases, the laws themselves are quite detailed, but the regulations are, you have books. The stormwater and the forest conservation are hundreds of pages. So in one sense, I don't think that's something even the council's going to be browsing through. I think parts of the public may, like if it's some, interest group, they may be able to do that. But in that sense, I think we just need to we need to keep that in mind. Like when we get a report, even when we get notified to the committee, I don't think staff's going to be able to present on a 100-page regulatory document to us necessarily. But I think to be mindful of that as we go through. So that's, I guess, all of my comments in terms of the public hearing section.
Okay, so Mr. Lyles, you're keeping track of all of these requested amendments?
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Are we leaving D to stand as it is? Because it speaks to reporting the adoption to the city council. I think the question was who actually adopts the regulation.
I would argue that throughout we replace the word adopt with promulgate and publish as appropriate. And I can present a new document that shows that.
Okay.
And in some of these, like in D, prior to the effective date, we don't have to say adoption because effective date is the promulgation, right? So effective date is the publication. So we can just take adoption out where you see it in D and the paragraph still holds.
Okay.
So if I may, I think that leads directly to section C on page 34. And I admit that I put that in as kind of a placeholder. It seems to me we need to have some statement that says when the rule is final. final rulemaking. So right now it reads, any regulation by Department, Board, or Commission may not become final until X number of time. And maybe what we need to say something more positive, will become final when it's promulgated. Right?
By whom is it promulgated here?
Whatever, the department, the board, or commission. So they've gone through steps, all the steps in B. And so C says, once you've done that and you've promulgated it, it's a final rule until such time as we come back to change it again or remove it or whatever.
Okay, so that simply needs to say the regulation becomes promulgated after.
Becomes final upon promulgation.
Okay.
The Mike has
Mr. Lyles?
another word.
It becomes effective upon publication.
A new word.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. So we're
So
gonna
we
revise
take
C.
out the city council
I don't
and
know how
two
much-
meetings and all of that.
Yes, and so
Yes,
what
okay.
happens here is whenever the promulgated or proposed regulation comes out, it's proposed. So it's not published as final, it's published as proposed. But when the effective date is when published as final, right?
Right.
So it becomes,
Yep.
so when we take the word draft or proposed off, it now is the final date, the effective
Okay.
date.
So that's C, correct?
right.
Madam Chair,
Alderman Savage?
just a quick question on that. I didn't quite hear all of that, but I just want to point out there's a bit of a, on line 34, there's an extra B. I don't think the BE.
Yeah, I got it.
Yep.
And also, I guess it sounded like we're going to remove the mention of the meetings, because I was also going to say remove legislative since we passed that ordinance.
We're taking that whole concept away and going to what Mr. Lyles said, which is becomes effective on the date that it's promulgated.
Okay.
Well,
As final rule.
Made final.
let me
made
say
final.
it so that it's clear and see if I'm getting you correct. Any regulation promulgated by a department, board, or commission becomes effective upon publication.
Right.
Becomes effective upon publication.
And that
Okay, so I will play devil's advocate. Published where and how?
Well, upon publication, as we state, the publications are website, maybe the local newspaper if we're still there.
I was thinking website only, that would go to that central repository.
So we can say
maybe that we want a hard copy of this available someplace, but really I think these days in the virtual reality, once it's put in that, whatever the button we call on the homepage, city rules and regulations or whatever, once it goes in there, it's published. And we can
say effective upon publication on the city's website.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the new C. Okay.
I only had one other thing, Madam Chair, and that's in E, where it currently says on line 5, appeal to the Circuit Court of Anne Arundel County. I would like to change that to appeal to the city's Board of Appeals. People can always take anything they want to take to the Circuit Court. This gives another bite at the apple. If we've gone through the whole promulgation process and people still have an objection, they have the opportunity to, if they have standing, and we always have to worry about what that means with the Board of Appeals, they can appeal it to the Board of Appeals saying the department didn't take into consideration my particular circumstances. So again, the steps here are, you make a notice of rulemaking, you go through the steps, You respond to the written comment, you promulgate, you publish a final rule, becomes effective. There's one last bite at the apple if somebody making, which is to appeal it to the Board of Appeals. This says to the Circuit Court. I'd argue Board of Appeals is more appropriate and more user-friendly to our citizens or businesses.
Mr. Lyles.
And Mr. Lyles has his hand up.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I don't know if the Board of Appeals is in a position to judge constitutionality. So we that paragraph needs to be crafted in a way that meets with the Board of Appeals purview, if you will. Because if you not everybody's a lawyer on there, and so would they know what arbitrary and capricious is? Would they know what unconstitutional? I don't think that they have the purview to decide what's unconstitutional or unlawful. So we may have to craft that paragraph in a way that maybe just says can be appealed to the Board of Appeals under its authority, and leave it at that, and then they know what they,
That's fine with me. I was trying to make it a more limited basis of appeal. But if you want to make it more open-ended,
well,
I agree with you. They don't.
Technically, I would say E should come out altogether. Why? Because everyone always has an appeal right to these regulations to the Circuit Court. So that's already there.
Right.
And so to me, since that's there and the court can judge constitutionality, arbitrary and capriciousness, something that's unlawful, and I think that's a better approach than the Board of Appeals. So take E out. Citizens always can go to the courts, and it's a much streamlined, better legislation in my view.
The problem with that is that you just don't flick a switch and go to Circuit Court. You need an attorney if you're not one. And I can tell you, you need to be very serious because you're probably talking about, tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees and other filing costs. And so the notion of keeping it in the city, it's a city rule. And if people feel aggrieved now, I think that the Board of Appeals can itself say, your appeal seems to be based on the fact that you don't like the rule. Too bad. You have to have something more substantive. So I don't think there's going to be a whole flood of things going to the appeals board. But I do think that it's important to have at least one stop left in the city where you can raise some concerns about a rule.
Yeah.
Mr. Lyles, didn't I just hear you say that you could take out E and add one sentence that simply says that they could take it to the Board of Appeals?
Well, yes, but let me just say this about the Board of Appeals, is that I don't quite agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Because you already essentially have the council saying this is okay, right? Either because you've had a hearing at Rules of City Government and you bless it. Now, are you saying that now the Board of Appeals, because someone feels aggrieved, even after you, the council, has said it's okay, the Board of Appeals can overrule you? I think that's a non sequitur for what we're dealing with here. I think we've given an opportunity for the public to be heard. The council can be heard. The council can put it on its own agenda and have a full council meeting. I think, and folks, if they feel particularly aggrieved by regulation, can go to Circuit Court. Only on the narrow issue of unconstitutionality, because we're talking executive staff here. So in my view, E should come out because it doesn't really get you any more than you already have as a citizen. And it, I think, muddies up where the appeals actually, under what standard the appeal would be adjudged.
Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I have some concern about this E for some of the reasons stated, but I guess questions may have to do with, or maybe best directed at the city attorney. Because my concern is, it just seems odd to be giving people another, like, would this essentially give people another avenue to challenge a law that we legally passed? It seems like people can always, and they have appealed our laws that were passed, but if they don't challenge that, and then they go ahead and challenge a regulation that was created, I don't know, that just seems a little redundant in my mind. It seems like the underlying legislation the law should change and be challenged, not just the regulation. But I don't know if that makes sense what I'm asking, but it just seems.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. And I'll give you an example. The regulations are really effectuating an ordinance that you passed. You have said trash, and Alderman Tierney and I have talked about this a couple times. You have said trash shall go out on Mondays. The staff has said trash will go out in green bins and we'll give them to you. Recycling will go out in blue bins. If you put your trash in the blue bin, we're not going to pick it up. Now, if somebody's aggrieved by that, now what they're saying is the law wrong? How many, as you said, how many bites of the apple? We're just effectuating the interests of the council in its ordinance. And so it's promulgating a regulation to get to the detail level of, yes, you said trash has to be out by 9, but how is the trash going to be put out there should be something that the staff can deal with based on the trucks and the traffic flow, a lot of things that the staff will be dealing with. And to have an appeal of just whether something goes in a blue bin or a black bin or a green bin, I think defeats the whole purpose of having the structure that we're even deciding or talking about today.
And it seems like if people had concerns like that, they could always go to, they're going to have ample opportunity to comment on any kind of regulation. And even if what gets written up, they may have concerns about, after that, I guess at that point, they'd be alleging that we didn't listen to or staff didn't listen to their comments and I guess they'd be, in this case, if we follow Alderman Arnett's direction, I guess they'd be going they could appeal to the Board of Appeals. And generally, I do agree with providing an easier avenue for appeal with the Board of Appeals, especially on a lot of the zoning issues, because I think it is burdensome for the public to go to circuit court. But in this case, I'm still just not.
Well, see, we have a lot of regulations that really aren't thought about as regulations. Right now, if you want to have an event in the city, you have to fill out a special event form. And everything in that form is a regulation. Now, if someone doesn't want to fill out something just because they don't like it or they think it's unfair to ask that you indemnify, or I don't want to have to sign my name and I don't want to have to tell anything about my private business in this form, now I've got to wait 60 days to approve an event because the Board of Appeals got to hear it or somebody's got to hear it and it's got to be published and then they've got to decide on it. We'd never get anything done in the city if regulations are going to be appealed. And I think that any time there's an opportunity for someone to stave off something that they don't have to do, they would do that. The ABC board similarly promulgates rules and regulations on how to do its licenses and applications, and you've got to come to the hearing. And I'm sure people would not want to do all of that in order to get their liquor license and would appeal everything. And we'd be waiting months or, for an appeal, the Board of Appeals, and then a decision, and then deciding what ABC board is going to do. There's a lot of regulations, and we could really get tied up in government if we had this appeal right here.
Well, I'm also thinking, just real quick, Madam Chair, again, thinking of a kind of an example is the stormwater regulations. They're incredibly somebody could certainly appeal various provisions. But then we'd be assuming, I guess, the Board of Appeals would have a lot to get up to speed on. Although I guess you could say the same thing about the circuit court. They're not exactly stormwater engineers either.
So am I hearing a consensus that we can eliminate completely letter E?
No.
Well, I think I'd like
Well,
to...
with the new language about the Board of Appeals that Mr. Lyles had given us.
Well, but that's not eliminating E. It's saying Board of Appeals, but I'm hearing Mr. Lyles say, and I understand his points, that the Board of Appeals may not be competent to hear some of these issues, A, and B, and I think I really worry that we're making an extreme exaggeration the rule, but it is true. If you have an appeal ability in there and people want to make mischief, they can prolong things. There's no doubt about it. But they are our citizens, and we're supposed to be serving them, and we're supposed to be sensitive to their needs. So I think there needs to be some method of appeal that is not as onerous as going to circuit court and as expensive and really out of reach for most of our constituents. Let's just be honest. I couldn't afford a $50,000 legal bill to go to the circuit court unless I was really, really.
So what's your answer, Alderman? Where will it go? Would it override the city council? Would it override the boards and commissions who've been empowered?
The Board of Appeals has lots of options. They could remand back to the issuing organization a finding that there was an ambiguity or an unfairness or whatever, and ask that organization to reconsider the regulation. I don't think
Mr. Lyles, and then Alderman Savage, and sorry, Alderman, I didn't mean to cut you off. And then Alderwoman Tierney had her hand up also.
Yeah, I would say that, as someone that's practicing the courts here in Anne Arundel and across the state, an appeal is not that difficult or onerous in my view. There is a cost, about $100 to file a complaint. Once you file a complaint, the circuit court judges are pretty adept at understanding if someone's appearing pro se and giving that person due opportunity in court to be heard on matters that they file on. But they do have to file on paper. They can now file electronically. They can submit a filing fee. They have to serve the other party. And that's just, certified mail or personal service. And that's about $50. So all told, you're probably talking about $200 to get in front of a circuit court judge. And you'd likely get in front of the circuit court judge, even for mediation, within about 30 to 60 days. And the circuit courts do ask that people who come and have expert testimony that they bring an expert. That may cost. But a lot of times people who are pro se, they don't have that kind of money, but you can be heard on the issues of unconstitutionality, and judges are pretty good at ferreting out those issues, especially when folks are coming pro se, they don't have lawyers and experts. And so I've never seen someone who files something, and we just, as a matter of fact, handled a writ of mandamus from an individual who was suing us because the police towed his car incorrectly, in his words. And he obviously didn't have a lawyer. He filed everything pro se, and we're still having to deal with it and file it, and the court is putting it on its docket, and we're dealing with it. He probably paid the $100, but he didn't have a lawyer, and his complaint, his pleading was irrational, but he was allowed to write it. And he was allowed to put all the stuff that he wanted to put in it, and we're going to have a hearing on it at some point. So it's not as onerous as people may think.
Alderman Savage, and then Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I mean, just my response, I think, to Alderman Arnett would be the recourse people have would be, even without this, would be they go to their elected official, and if it's something that we can always update the code on oversight or if they say, well, you really need to be changing the colors of the recycle bin, we can go ahead and make that change via legislation. It doesn't have to be a lawsuit, or they can come elected official and we could sit down with the city manager and say, hey, can we just have is staff able to just change this regulation to address X, Y, or Z issue. So I think there are definitely other avenues instead of doing or going to the Board of Appeals.
Alderwoman Tierney.
Oh, thank you,
Welcome.
Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for letting me listen in. And just, I have two questions. Well, one is a comment. Is the process that Alderman Arnett is stating is to prevent, ultimately to prevent an appeal? I mean, you have a very, logical process, a public hearing, et cetera. But my question is do regulations reach the level of constitutionality? I mean, what are they appealing? And so if it's something that significant that they're appealing, then you have to question whether or not that regulation should actually be in the code. I mean, I think I'm just curious about that. I mean, we're raising the level of these regulations to be that important that they can be appealed. It just gets a little blurry with the code. And as Alderman Arnett, I mean, if people do their job right, if the departments do their job right, they have a code and then they write regulations per the code. So I don't understand, although I respect the appeal process. To comment, City Attorney.
Alderman Arnett, would you like to respond?
Well, sure. So I'm taking to heart what's being said. I do think the notion of going to circuit court is intimidating and off-putting and quite frankly out of the reach of many of our citizens. But I also agree with Mr. Lyle's observation that the Board of Appeals is not suited to deal with constitutionality questions. That's more for the courts. I was focusing more on concerns of arbitrary and capricious, but I agree with Alderman Savage's comment that that's what we're for. So if people feel that a department is making an arbitrary or capricious or inconsiderate thing, they can come to us. So I guess in the final analysis, I'm fine with eliminating this section when we get the redraft. I've been convinced. I hate to be so intransigent, but...
Alderman Savage, and then we can go on to F.
Just a quick distinction on this, because I do think it's important to state that we're talking about appealing regulations that have been newly adopted, not even enacted, right? Because I know that's a completely separate question of well, how, in terms of whatever new construction or in terms of how we apply regulations for site design. That's a completely separate line of appeal. This is just having to do with reviewing new regulations, which anyway, that just has helped in my mind. That's it, Madam Chair. It
actually, in my mind, was not just that. I bring to mind a ruling that the harbor master made that no dinghies could dock at the foot of City Dock with an outboard more than 90 horsepower. And that impacted someone who had just recently purchased a brand new 115 horsepower outboard, which was at the time legal, and the code was changed. And that person wanted redress because, what's the difference in that number of horsepower? Is it putting in more pollution? What was the reason for that? And it was definitely an impact. Anybody who's bought a brand new outboard motor knows that it's not chump change. So if it's a rule that is arbitrary or capricious or seems that way to you, they wanted to have a hearing. Now, they did exactly what you pointed out, Rob. They came to me and asked me. I went to the harbor master, and the harbor master said, no way, the rule is 90 and that's it. Which I had the option then of writing code to say no, outboards of up to 115 horsepower per city code can be on dinghies that are docking. I didn't do that, but I could have done that. So there was a recourse.
Okay. Do we have an issue with letter F, which is the recurring evaluation of regulations? Manager Gerald, what do we do now with regulations? How frequently are they revisited and evaluated?
Never, as far as I know. So I don't think that this is a bad idea to do this. And it's every 5 years, so that seems like a reasonable amount of time. I don't think they're revisited at all right now. Not in my 10 years of history here.
And is this another, well, I shouldn't say another, but an arduous task for the department heads?
Well, I think once we get them compiled, which is going to be required by these changes, I think once it's compiled, then it's a much easier. I think this first task of getting them all compiled and understood and centralized is going to be but that's a guesstimate on my part because I don't know how many regulations there are out there. So we can report back at the next meeting if you'd like, because we're doing that effort right now. But I think once we go through this effort, then it won't be such a big undertaking because they'll all be centralized and it will be much more streamlined.
And maybe it would be helpful if they have an opportunity to evaluate these regulations. I don't want to say on an ongoing basis, but not just waiting for the 5-year mark, but to be able to evaluate them as they use them, for example. To note
I think if there's issues that come up as they're being implemented, that they should be, updated.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else?
Well, Madam Chair, I just thought I'd take a second to recap. I've listened to a lot of the comments and taken them to heart, and I'm looking forward to a revised version of this from the Office of Law. I think that this legislation is necessary because the current code is prohibitive of writing regulations, even though I think we should be able to write regulations. I do think that this is a good exercise to go before the council because it reminds us that we should be paying attention to the things that are being done in our names under the auspices of the rules of the city. And I do think that this is going to overall have a positive effect of getting people to go back and look at things. I know there's some things like, for example, we changed the code to have hearings before the Board of Appeals beyond the record rather than de novo. And one of the complaints that I got was the Board of Appeals hasn't changed their procedures, which are rules, to reflect that they're now hearing the rules on the record rather than de novo. So some of this, I think, can remind us that we need to update the rules when we change the code. I mean, that's part of the reason why we write code. And then I think this will lead overall to a better definition. To me, code is a reflection of the policies that the council over time has passed that is the general way that we want to see the city run. Rules are how the staff put into effect activating the code, the auspices of the code. And I'm in agreement with the Office of Law and happy that the Office of Law has brought that new sort of reflection of how this all should work. I do think that there is something we're going to have to sort out about what is executive and what is legislative, but I think we can get there. And I think this, when we get it tweaked up, will move us a long way towards that.
Well, I'm reading the last, letter G. I didn't realize that we have a reading room and one that's maintained by the city clerk. But looking at that timeline, is that a fair timeline for staff to expect them to have all of these outlined and available for public consumption by July 1 of 2021? Mr. Lyles?
Well,
I know you're going to say you don't have a reading room, right?
He does.
I thought it was in the corner of your office, actually.
There is a reading room. There is. In fact, I've used it. That place where we have the journals for every year, where all the legislation and the legislative changes, those bound documents, are in the Office of Law. So if you ever want to know the genesis, I mean, you can find it also online now through the online stuff where you can click on the changes, but there's actually a hard copy room. Now, it's not for regulations, it's for code, but it is in a physical location.
Alderman, are you talking about the conference room in the law department?
I'm talking about those, yeah, well, wherever it is.
That you've now changed into a reading room in the law department? Is that what we're talking about?
It is a shelf that contains all of the legislative changes that we've made in code.
You didn't answer my question. Are you talking about the conference room that's in the law department that has bookshelves in it, that has passcodes on it?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought.
But
not the reading room. But
we suggested earlier that this be made virtual. I don't know how voluminous it's going to be, so you're right in bringing our attention to that. Some people don't have computers and access or facility. So I guess the question is, for those people, if they want to see the regulations and they can't go to the website, how do they get to see the regulations?
Mr. Lyles, you have the answer.
With all due respect, we do not have room to read. We do not have room for any more bodies. We have the elections staff in the conference room. Our office is filled to capacity. We have books that we do not have shelf space for, and the code takes up all of the shelving in the conference room, along with our books.
I discovered it today when I came down to City Hall for the first time in like 6 months. It's by the soda machine. Don't you now have bookshelves out there next to the soda machine?
Yes, we do.
But there is no chair. So I guess that doesn't count. But I'm not sure we want to keep that.
We would love to have a reading room. 200, 300 square feet.
We would love to have an office, but you know what? That doesn't happen.
They could take our space.
Well, they might as well. But anyway.
Just as we know Ross likes all of his books, so we could put him in his cubicle and just make that the reader.
We can do that.
We could subdivide it out into, that little space where the computer is could be our little reading room.
To me.
We're on your piece of legislation and it's been 1 hour and 35 minutes. Really mean to you?
But the library also provides free printouts.
Yeah, I think this has been a very good session. I think this is what committee work should be.
Mr. Lyles, I didn't catch the end of what you were saying. I'm sorry.
The public library, folks can go online and print out documents if they don't want to go online.
Okay. So can we take that portion out of this? And I'm concerned about the timeline that's in it.
Well, the timeline may be a problem, but I do think there are people who English is their second language, people who don't have computers. It's the same issue that's coming up with virtual learning for students. And I think some people don't have access to that. Are we just saying tough? If you're not fluent enough to have this capability, you don't get to partake?
Alderman, Mr. Lyles just mentioned something we've forgotten about, that we do have libraries. We do have a public library on West Street, a brand new one that does have access to computers. We don't seem to have space, but that doesn't mean there isn't space. I just think it's a mistake to put that in our department when we don't have space to do what we're already committed to doing. It doesn't say we're denying access to anyone. And with everything being electronic, they can get it on a phone. Everybody's got a phone, but, and in different languages. So just keep that in mind.
It won't.
So what's do we need a timeline here? When do you want to have staff to have this all done? And I think the expectation of July 1 is stretching it. Manager Gerald?
Yeah, I would just suggest 6 months after passage. We're not sure when this is going to be passed by the full council. So I would just suggest that we change that and just say within 6 months after passage. And I think that gives us enough time, because all this is asking for is the existing ones that we have be posted on the city's website.
But it doesn't say existing. It says all regulations adopted prior to this date. In my mind, that means everything.
Yeah, all the existing ones, right?
Yeah,
I think that was the intent, is all the existing ones.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because that's not what it says, but that's what we want to amend it to say.
So there's two thoughts here. One is we have the central site. The other is it a physical reading room? I do think we are running the risk of excluding a significant portion of our population. But if you think they can get this by going to the library, I question that. But then again, maybe those are not people that are going to be particularly interested in looking at regulations anyway. So the thing I agree with David's language of 6 months after passage makes perfect sense. If you want to strike a physical reading room, which is this is referring to, that is how it's done with the federal regulations. Every single federal organization, down to relatively small ones, has shelf after shelf of the CFR. And they're consulted, depending upon the agency, on a fairly regular basis. But in the new modern world, I suspect that most feds actually go online rather than going down and pulling out volume such and such.
So we won't go backwards.
Wait a minute.
Alderman Savage.
Yeah, just to clarify, that it looks like some of the existing language in on line 14 and 15, that's already in the code where all regulations adopted prior to
Right.
this date must be posted on the city's website. So that's, but I don't think that's something we've been doing, at least not with everything. I think some departments have been. So, and I think it is, and I also think that staff, if somebody came to them and asked them to review, or the law office, I should say, to review some regulations, I think they'll make reasonable accommodations for folks and work with them to accomplish that.
Mr. Lyles?
Yeah, normally what we do for those regulations that we have purview over, we just we print off the regulations and we may provide it to an individual that comes to the office, at least in the old days, or email or mail it to the individuals if they need it mailed. So we've done that before, especially with ABC regulations, rules.
So that line 16 made available to the public upon request would be sufficient?
Well, that may be a question for Mr. City Manager as well.
So could we eliminate the rest of that sentence?
It's fine with me.
Mr. Gerald, Mr. Alderman Arnett?
Yeah.
That's fine with me.
Okay.
And add the language that David suggested, saying that will be available within 6 months after passage of the ordinance.
Okay, was it within 6 months?
Yes, that's what that's what I have. Within 6 months of passage of this ordinance, all regulations promulgated prior to this date must be published on the city's website.
I like it.
Will they be promulgated or?
Promulgated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because once they're published, they are effective.
Okay.
Effective upon publication, according to that last paragraph, the paragraph from page 2.
Okay, Alderwoman Tierney?
You're going to hate this question, but...
Then don't ask it.
But, yeah, I will very quickly. Whereas HPC has guidelines in lieu of regulations. So where
Same
do
thing.
guidelines fit into this, or are they the same thing? And is that clear? I know. David's like, no.
The ones I've read, they're mixed, but they're probably more regulations when it comes to how you actually get in front of the HPC, the dates, the forms, all that's regulation.
Okay. So
Once it comes to how they deliberate, there may be guidelines about how they deliberate, but the actual getting in front of them are the regulations.
Okay.
The appeals.
So just one last thing, if I may, Madam Chair, and this is to the city attorney, and this is coming from my dialogue with Mr. Conlon. I like the delineation he makes, which is regulations are the publication, but they're publishing rules and procedures. And at the federal level, it's called rulemaking. It's not called regulation making. Does that make any sense to you?
Rules and regulations are the same thing.
Okay.
So that's why his distinctions are a distinction without a difference. And in this particular case, I think it's better for our code, at least, to make a hard stop on when it's effective, and it's upon publication. So you don't want to put publication in the definition when we're also using it as an effective time, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I thank you for that, because he took the time to write up comments, and he took the time to talk to me on the phone. So I want to take the time to get back to him with the fruits of this. So I accept your way of thinking about that, which I think is consistent with his as well. I just didn't know whether we needed to. He questioned when in the current code it says rules and regulations that have the force of law, implying that there's regulations and there's rules, and also implying that some that have force of law and some that don't. So there were four quadrants there.
Yeah, I mean, we consider rules to be regulations, no matter really how you title them. If it's telling someone how to go through a door to access the policy laid out by the code, it's a regulation. And it's only a regulation in the common parlance if you look at Merriam-Webster or Black's dictionary, because it differentiates from what the legislative branch can do and the executive branch. But a rule, regulation, however you want it, it's all going to be the same if it's coming out of the executive side of the government.
And then just one last question. How do we define bandwidth?
That's beyond my expertise.
Madam Chair, I would move that there's no further business and that we adjourn.
I'm here for transportation. Sorry.
I was looking to see if Alderman Schandelmeyer had joined us, but it doesn't appear. I'm showing 11 people, but I only see 9 people on the screen and Julian. No. So I don't know who the other person is.
He's not.
Sally? Okay, he's not here.
No, he's not here.
Okay, that was Takia. Okay. All right. So, Mr. Lyles, will you be able to bring these amendments or these changes back to the Rules Committee next meeting next month?
I'll have them for everybody tomorrow, and you can put them on your agenda, sure.
Okay. All right.
We have to wait until tomorrow?
Well, I'd have them for you by midnight if you're going to be up.
No, that's okay.
No, thank you.
Next month is fine.
Did you postpone adequate facilities?
Yeah. Right.
Yes, we did.
Yes, we did.
Oh, okay. That's all right. I enjoyed this discussion.
And Alderman Schandelmeyer didn't show up for 051, so we'll postpone action on that until next month, or he tells us when it's ready. If there's no further business, we've exhausted our agenda, at least one piece of legislation. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
Second. Thank you, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
This meeting's adjourned.